Our next speaker is Tavis Ormandy, who's going to be giving a talk on Sophail, a critical analysis of Sophos antivirus. So if you would, please join me in welcoming Tavis to the stage.
Thanks. So my talk is called Sophail, a critical analysis of Sophos antivirus. So a brief introduction. So it's quite often that antivirus vendors will assert that they must be protected from scrutiny. They claim that if attackers understood how they work, then this could harm end users. It could cause chaos. But I disagree with this. If you examine any security system and the system is then weakened, then the system was flawed and it should be reviewed or fixed or whatever. Obscurity removes any incentive to improve, and if people don't know how it works, then they can't complain about it. They can't look for improvement. They can't find holes and weaknesses and fix them. And this talk kind of applies this principle to Sophos antivirus. And I'm going to be looking at some of the product claims that are made by the vendor. I usually introduce myself as a Unix security researcher. My research is primarily vulnerability discovery, exploitation, and mitigation. I mostly focus on operating system and low-level security, and this is mostly memory corruption related. I'm not interested in malware, and I don't study malware at all. Antivirus it's interesting to me primarily because it's a large exposed attack surface that I can try and break. It's not particularly interesting as a mitigation. So this talk will be from the perspective of a vulnerability researcher. But don't worry, I don't work with Sophos. This isn't a sales pitch. So a little bit about malware and antivirus in general. So there's little intersection between my work as a vulnerability researcher and the work of antivirus vendors. Malware is only interesting as a post-compromise concept. Before malware has any effect at all, then an attacker must be able to execute code. In everyday life, this is usually access to a user who makes poor trust decisions, such as someone I'm able to email an executable to and they'll just run it. It's true that malware can be part of a payload for an exploit, but we would respond differently. Antivirus vendors would typically try to blacklist each sample that each exploit that they can see, whereas a vulnerability researcher would try to mitigate it or fix the vulnerability. So most security researchers work on the assumption that users make good trust decisions, and then we try to find ways to subvert that, or find ways around that. But antivirus vendors work on the assumption that users can't make good trust decisions, and then they try to compensate for that. And this kind of makes sense. So the problem with this is that antivirus vendors are right, that many users, maybe even the majority, that just can't make good trust decisions. And there's plenty of evidence for this. And realistically, maybe they shouldn't have to. It can be pretty complex, especially in the Windows world. On Linux, users usually have access to big package repositories where the trust decisions have mostly already been made for them. Maybe not perfectly, but it's a pretty good start. On Windows, it can be much harder work. On Linux, even if you step outside the package repositories, normally developers understand how to sign packages, and users can make trust decisions this way, for example. But on Windows, that's just not the case. At best, you normally get authenticated signatures. So antivirus vendors and vulnerability researchers usually agree that the solution to this problem is to offload the decision-making process to someone or something that is capable. We begin to diverge on how to implement that process. So the solution proposed by antivirus vendors is essentially a complex blacklisting scheme. I think people understand that antivirus is imperfect and reactionary in nature, but it's common knowledge that it's generally believed by most people that it's better than nothing. People generally understand how antivirus works, even if they're non-technical. They understand that antivirus vendors will try and find this malicious code and then blacklist it. And blacklist is a pretty easy concept to understand. Even non-technical people understand that if you wanted to set up a bank account, you wouldn't try to blacklist all the bad people in the world. You'd just try to whitelist the good ones who should be able to access it. And this is pretty easy to understand. So perhaps it's pretty reasonable, but you need a way to evaluate that. And how do you evaluate And how do you evaluate something like this? You normally have to ask yourself whether this additional attack surface that you're adding to your systems decreases your overall attack surface. So we don't know how to build perfectly secure systems just because all software has a non-zero defect rate. And the best that systems designers can do in general is try and build systems that the cost of investing in a compromise is above the value of that compromise. And there's no reason security products can't be a legitimate part of that. So the classic example of a legitimate security product is a firewall. Even though you're adding additional attack surface by this whole new network stack that's going to be used to process and apply your ACLs, for example, once you've installed it, the overall exposure of the systems behind it should be greatly reduced. So that's a good decision. Obviously, that's not the case for antivirus, which falls into another category where you, in exchange for an increase in attack surface, then you're enforcing some security boundary. So in order to evaluate that, we need to understand a few more things. So the promise that antivirus makes is that in exchange for a fairly dramatic increase in exposed attack surface, users will be less dependent on making good trust decisions. And if the way that your network is architectured is that users are permitted to make good trust decisions, but you've got evidence that they can't do so safely, then maybe that's a good trade. Because you need to do something about that urgently, because that's obviously the major hole in your systems. But to be able to make a decision, we need to understand what antivirus does and how to evaluate that. Exactly how much attack surface are we trading, and how effective is the solution going to be? Unfortunately, this is pretty hard to do. Antivirus vendors, in general, just won't explain what it is that they do. The best you can get is really is marketing material. They simply don't publish technical specifications, and they won't. There's no way of understanding what it is that their marketing claims equate to. There's no way of testing it because the claims are usually pretty vague. They usually make claims about threats, but they never define what a threat is or how they classify them. The marketing material tends to be pretty much high-level doublespeak. They make up nice Hollywood-sounding names, but there's little technical substance to these, and there's little way to try and understand what's happening. And so it's really hard to make a good decision about whether installing antivirus would actually reduce the overall exposure of your systems. So the intention of this talk, really, rather than being any kind of advisory, it's more of the missing technical specifications for Sophos antivirus. The idea being that those tasked with evaluating antivirus will have a better chance of doing so thoroughly if they understand what it is the product does, rather than having to take the marketing material at face value. So with a better understanding of what these products do, then you can make a more informed decision about whether this makes sense in the context that you want to deploy it. So I've written a paper on this with more technical details and tools to accompany this talk, and so I'll be releasing it. Today. So maybe it's possible that you rely on industry testing to try and to determine whether antivirus is effective or not. But really, these antivirus comparisons, you all use similar methodologies in their tests. Essentially, they just have a corpus of collected malware, and then they just scan it and then they record the results. They don't have any understanding of what the product their testing does. It's entirely a black box. They basically just pump some malware through and record which ones hit it. It's not particularly thorough or a good way of testing, a good way of evaluating whether the product works or not. The security press usually don't have the technical expertise to understand to evaluate the vendor claims. They tend to focus on usability and things like perception of performance, impact, that kind of thing. Yeah. So this talk is an attempt to remedy this. And I've done that by reverse engineering the Sophos antivirus engine. Today I'm going to provide some of the missing specifications. So I haven't had any access to proprietary knowledge. I've done this only with tools and techniques that are available to any attacker. I'm not releasing any like secret information that can never be known otherwise. And yes, I'm not discussing vulnerabilities today. Only design and implementation. Only the design and implementation of the tools that Sophos ship. So Sophos is pretty widely used. It often scores well in industry tests. They ship a number of security products, in fact, quite a few. But today I'm only discussing the core antivirus product, which is the same engine is used on all the platforms they support, which includes the Windows desktop product. And it's also part of the SDK that they license to third parties for use on content scanning gateways and email gateways and so on. And same for Mac, and they also have a Linux product. It all uses the same code. The version tested was the latest available. This is and still I don't think there's been a new version since. And so yeah, I shared a draft of this of the paper I'm releasing with Sophos. So this isn't this isn't going to be a surprise to them. They were good-natured about it, and they responded to some of my criticisms. I'm going to get started on one of the first components of the Sophos engine, and that's signature matching. So this is a claim from Sophos technical specifications. It says Sophos dynamic code analysis technology utilizes sophisticated pattern matching techniques and identifies viruses by rapidly analyzing specific code sequences known to be present within a virus. Virus patterns are created to ensure that the engine catches not only the original virus, but derivatives written within the same virus family, which certainly sounds pretty impressive, but doesn't really explain about what it does, how it matches code, or by derivatives, I assume it means different versions of the same virus, or if the author reused some code in some different in different builds, then they can detect that. But they don't really explain how this works. So static file signatures are really the core mechanism Sophos uses to blacklist no malicious code. I reverse engineered this, and the core signature matching VM, and the file format itself that Sophos distribute. And I've also written some tools that allow inspection of these signatures. So anyone can take a look at these and try to reproduce my results. And so yeah, I'm going to be releasing some source code that you can do that with later today. So the Sophos signature files themselves are distributed in file format. Sophos calls them IDEs, but the actual format internally is called Sophtainers. And this is a generic container format that Sophos uses to distribute all data files to clients. These contain different partitions and sections that start with a different identifier that describes what's in this next section. The files begin with a table of contents section. Then there's a list of different sections that can be extracted from the file. Sections can have different flags, and those flags are things like this section will be compressed, or this section will be encrypted. The encryption isn't really much use. The only algorithm they support for encryption is XOR, and the key is included in the file itself, so it's a pretty questionable value. They statically link a very old zlib for decompression. It wouldn't normally matter because, of course, this is trusted data, but it turns out that the authentication scheme for these files is very weak. So this is part of the attack surface, really. I'm going to explain a bit about the authentication scheme later. So yeah, all the files that Sophos distribute to clients use this container format. And this is a typical header from a Sophtainer file. You can see that the Sophos like this Microsoft style of using multi-byte character constants, and they use it for the identifiers. So you can see it in ASCII. There's different sections and the table of contents and partition lists and so So the signature files are signed by Sophos. However, they use a proprietary authentication scheme that they invented themselves. So I've examined this thoroughly, and I'm going to be discussing a bit about it later. Okay. So the signatures themselves are contained within these IDE sections. These contain some variable width chunks that contain details about the signature, and of course the signature themselves. The way a signature is formed is it's basically a Pascal string that contains the virus name in one chunk, followed by one or more bytecode programs that are used for matching the file. So these bytecode programs are basically for a proprietary VM. And Sophos executes these programs for each file that they're trying to match. So I've written some tools to extract and disassemble this bytecode, and so we can examine it in a bit more detail. So the VM is a simple stack-based virtual machine. It has single byte opcodes, but variable width operands. There's an RPN like stack for computation. It has some named locations that they use like registers. You can do some file pointer manipulation, and you can do some basic I/O of the input file. They use this for doing things like reading offsets from a file, and then seeking to the offset, and then reading some more data, that kind of thing. So these are some sample opcodes. I don't actually know the name of the opcodes, but I've just given them names based on what they look like they do. So here are some typical ones, like CRC32 will run CRC32 on the next n bytes. And it checks whether it matches the immediate CRC encoded in the bytecode. And there's some file pointer manipulation. You can read some data onto the stack, and then you can do some arithmetic on it, for example. And yes, and so on. So this is a sample program. It's for a signature that was called attention 629. I have no idea what that is. It's just a random example I chose. So here's a sample program. You can see that it does literal IW, which just matches 2-byte immediate data, and then a literal IB, which just matches one single immediate byte. Then it does some file pointer manipulation by seeking to relative offset, and then does some CRC of some data. So that CRC32 is match the next 6 bytes from the current file pointer location with the last 4 bytes. And then some more file pointer manipulation. So that sample was probably, I would say, above average complexity for a Sophos signature. Because it includes some file pointer manipulation. The vast majority of signatures follow an even simpler pattern, which is basically they encode a small amount of literal data that has to be found, and then they do two consecutive CRC32s on the following data. I don't really know the justification for doing two separate CRC32s, and it's often the maximum that the bytecode format allows for is 256 bytes, but it's quite much less than that. So I'm not really sure why they do that. But I suspect most of these are automatically generated because the code that actually checks them, it rarely makes sense. It's normally completely irrelevant. Sometimes it's things like section padding or some embedded data from the file. Things like strings and things like that. It just makes absolutely no sense. That could be trivially changed. And often it's very small code sequences, like just things like 5 or 6 bytes, which is just which would be like a pretty common instruction. It's pretty bizarre. I can only assume that they're automatically generated because they just don't make sense. So the core of most signatures that Sophos ship is basically just CRC32 some byte sequence. So as you can imagine, this is pretty weak. CRC32 is not a really cryptographic hash function. It's really basically just the intended use is basically just for catching bit flips on data transfer, that kind of thing. So it's unclear why they rely on such a scheme. You might argue that the intention is for speed, but That's probably not the case because CRC32, the CRC32 implementation that Sophos has is not very good quality. And in fact, if you benchmark it versus MD5 from OpenSSL, MD5 from OpenSSL is only 1 cycle per byte slower than the CRC32 that Sophos ship. And they don't take advantage of they don't take advantage of things like SEC, so they could do 4 simultaneous checksums, and they don't use the hardware CRC in SEC 4.2, I think. The performance argument probably doesn't work. Because it's so weak, it introduces a number of problems. In fact, it's quite strange that Sophos rely on such a weak signature scheme because there have been a number of there's a large body of work explaining how to do this properly. Most researchers who study things like code fingerprinting tend to focus on things like CFG matching, or fuzzy CFG matching it's sometimes called, which is basically looking at the control flow graph. This seems to have the best known properties. The properties are certainly a lot better than CRC32. So I would say it's self-evident that one of the core goals of an antivirus engine, an antivirus signature scheme, would be to minimize false positives. And obviously CRC32 is just basically zero collision resistance. We can automatically generate collisions. We can automatically generate pre-images instantly. But even naive is only 32 bits, so you could basically just brute force it, even if there was no known way to do this. It's trivial. So Sophos have ignored this, and it's resulted in what is, I think, fair to say, a pretty weak signature scheme. In fact, it's not only obvious that collisions would be widespread, but you can automatically generate pre-images for any, not for any, but for many Sophos signatures. And I've written a tool to do this. One of the main problems that this introduces is pool pollution attacks, where basically you can just, which is well known in things like in defeating IDS alerts, by basically just spamming them until the alerts are disabled. And of course, the same thing is possible here. So generating these CRC32 pre-images is just trivial, but even if it wasn't a naive attack, you could just brute force it in minutes on regular commodity hardware. So I can produce these with a tool. I hope you can see this. But I've generated them, and you can scan them, and Sophos will identify them. And I've got tools to produce these for most signatures. Some are more complicated, and I can't do it automatically yet. But I mean, you can do it manually, but just by reading it, it's not a problem. So in Sophos technical specifications, they say that their researchers spend time creating these good quality generic signatures. So I got some malware samples and looked at Sophos signatures and tried to check whether this claim makes sense. They do have a lot of signatures, so I can't check them all. So it's possible there are exceptions. But I see very little evidence that they're aware of the context of the signatures that they're creating. They quite often check completely irrelevant dead code or trivial code, or code that could be the code is some compiler generated stub. It doesn't make any sense at all. So I did find a few counterexamples, but they are really in the minority. I suspect that most of them are automatically generated, and I don't really think this claim is probably exaggeration. So the Sophos signatures are distributed as bytecode for this VM. They rely heavily on CRC32, and even the non-automatically generated signatures tend to be pretty poor quality. So I think it's pretty safe to say that the signature scheme is pretty weak in general. Moving on to another component of the Sophos ship, I'm going to look at the exploit mitigation system. So Sophos sell a runtime exploit mitigation system for Windows systems. I think it's pretty good that they tried to do this, but unfortunately the system was pretty poorly researched and it's very badly broken. It's not really necessary to defeat the exploit mitigation because it really makes very little sense. But I'm gonna describe how it works now. So This product is called the Sophos Buffer Overflow Detection System. And the Sophos position this as one of the four major components of their HIP system. This is how they describe it. This detection system will catch attacks targeting security vulnerabilities in both operating system software and applications. And this is from the Sophos website. So the product internally seems to be called BOPS, for BOPS. That's the Buffer Overflow Protection Service. I assume it's service. It could be system. I don't know. I'm just guessing. So Sophos touted it as one of their 4 layers of detection. There's no technical documentation or specifications at all. They don't describe how it works or what it does. The system was naively obfuscated to try and make it harder to understand, but it really posed little challenge to try and extract the configuration data. So this is how it works. It's implemented entirely in user space, and it's loaded into the address space of most processes using app-init DLLs, which is the registry key, where you can load additional modules. I say most because this only affects processes that use user32, obviously, because that's where app-init DLLs is read from. And the BOP service is written using Microsoft detours, which is used to intercept various APIs. And so you can see that it's loaded into every process at runtime. So there's the Sophos product claims. Although I wouldn't say that they claim to the contrary, they don't make it very clear about how this works. But it only works on Windows versions prior to Vista. But the bizarre thing is, it's actually installed and loaded on all versions of Windows, but it just sits there doing nothing. Unless you're on Windows XP, it basically just sits there and as a loaded module doing nothing. It never installs the hooks, and it just stays there. So how it was intended to work is that Sophos wanted to implement 2 weak forms of runtime exploit mitigation. One was basically an SEH op work-alike, and another was ret to Lipsy detection and prevention. So a quick recap on what these attacks are. So SEH overwrite protection. Traditionally, it was SEH overwrite was a very simple method of exploiting stack buffer overflows in Windows. I'd say it's pretty much neutered these days because Microsoft has started shipping runtime integrity verification, and there's also compile time mitigation. But it's fair to say that safe SEH, which is the build time mitigation, has some drawbacks, well-known drawbacks, which are primarily based on the entire build has to opt in for it to be effective. And SEHOP is from Microsoft's SEHOP implementation is only available in versions of Vista. So it's not entirely unreasonable to try and ship a runtime exploit mitigation system for XP because XP is pretty weak in this area. But it's worth pointing out that there are a number of good quality free implementations that do the same thing. So SEHOP is essentially a solved problem at this point. Matt Miller was the guy who published the most work on the subject and invented the technique that Microsoft currently ship. So the key insight that Matt had that he published was that SEHOP that in order to make SEH overwrite harder was he could insert a canary at the tail of the exception handler chain, and then the list integrity could be checked at runtime. And you do this at system when the system dispatched an exception. So this way, the system can verify that the chain has not been tampered with, and it's more trustworthy. So there were good quality implementations available with source code. The most famous one is WenTrust, which is the one that Matt wrote. So hopefully that's readable. This is the pseudocode that Matt published. The idea was that when you hook the exception dispatch, and then you start walking the chain looking for the canary value at the end, If you can verify that the chain looks good, then you continue and let the system continue. Otherwise, you abort it because someone's corrupted it. So Sophos implementation was clearly inspired by Matt's work. They do pretty much the same thing. They hook the exception dispatch and they try to do some work verifying the integrity of the chain. But unfortunately, it demonstrates a bit of a problem understanding. It demonstrates a bit of a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem. So I reverse engineered Sophos's implementation, and I've written some pseudocode in the same style of Matt, so you can compare it. So basically, all they do is they check for the first 2 links in the chain. They check that that it doesn't point within the current thread stack, and this is essentially the only check, and then that's permitted. So this just doesn't make any sense. It's such a weak mitigation that it's just trivially easy to defeat. You barely have to work it at all. Only the most standard non-modified payloads could possibly be intercepted by this. It's ridiculously weak. Even a low-skilled attacker can defeat this mitigation. I suspect Sophos misunderstood the published information on this. Resulted in what they've shipped as basically a broken implementation of what is an already known solved problem. So perhaps the most obvious attack against this is just simply ret to Lipsy. But Sophos did appear to consider this, and they implement their own ret to Lipsy protection. So just a quick summary of return to Lipsy. So it's originally developed by Solid Designer, and it was initially intended to demonstrate weaknesses in early stack overflow mitigations. But of course, it's still an important technique. But it's been generalized over time to apply to more scenarios. Now it's sometimes referred to as ROP, but it's essentially the same technique. So the correct solution to try and mitigate return to Lipsy is usually a strong ASLR implementation. Because of course, if you can't predict where the code you want to execute is located, then you can't return into it. But it's a pretty reasonable observation that ASLR is not strong on all Windows platforms, particularly XP, where it's non-existent. So Sophos' solution to this problem is called protected functions, and it's part of this POP system. So what it does at load time, it passes an encrypted configuration file listing various APIs that Sophos believe are most likely to be used by attackers in their ret to Lipsy payload. They then hook these routines using detours, and then from within the detours callback, they verify the caller was from a recognized module and that the return address is not within the current thread stack. So the problem with this is it's just complete nonsense. Sophos simply just didn't understand the problem, and their mitigation just doesn't work. So I think what happened was that Sophos were confused because in the original ret to Lipsy exploits, people would return into system just because it's nice and convenient. You don't have to do anything. Why wouldn't you? But this was done because it was convenient, not because there was any technical requirement to do this. And in fact, modern exploits have made finding these collections of useful code sequences and using them in your payload a science. And these are sometimes called gadgets now. And a attacker can simply piece these together from other locations, or you can just call the routine indirectly. Or you could just return immediately after the hook, the detour is inserted, and it's defeated. That's it. It's pointless. So Sophos were attempting to enumerate known bad, and it just doesn't work in this case. It doesn't make any sense, and because attackers repurposing existing trusted code. So all the trusted code suddenly becomes untrusted, and this is you just can't blacklist it this way. So I wouldn't recommend using Sophos' return to Lipsy mitigation. It's worse than useless. So Sophos keep the list of routines that they hook a secret, and they also a list of image names that they whitelist. The configuration file is encrypted with a hard-coded 64-bit symmetric key. Of course, it's easy to recover, and I've put the key right there. So, however, there is an extra level of security. after they've extracted this file, they then encrypt it with the 8-bit hard-coded key 0x93. It's a bit of a mystery why they do that, but obviously it provides no additional security. It's useless. So the encryption scheme that they use, it's not a peer-reviewed or published algorithm. It's called SPMAA, and I've reverse engineered it. I've got a C implementation so that you can extract the configuration file and look at it. And so I'm releasing some tools, and one of them is called SPMAA util, which is an implementation of this, and that's a command you can use to extract the file if you wanted to look at it. So the BOPS configuration file also contains a list of image names, and these protections are only applied to the protections listed in this file. These are some examples, things like QuickTime Player, Acro-Read32, Outlook, and so on. I guess the things you would expect. So even if BOPS mitigation did work, it would really only apply to these, and any other software it is essentially a big no-op. It does nothing. I don't really know the justification for that. I would guess maybe it's because they're scared of breaking stuff. But these things are supposed to be generic in nature. I mean, attackers would simply focus on the things that where the weakest mitigations are, of course. So I'm not sure the justification for that. Of course, it's loaded whether it's whitelisted or not. The module is still loaded. It just doesn't do anything. So I'll talk about this SPMA encryption algorithm that Sophos used throughout their products. So it's a proprietary, it's 64-bit Feistel block cipher, and Sophos use it pretty much everywhere where they need encryption inside their product. It's undocumented, unpublished, and it's not peer-reviewed, obviously. But Sophos rely on it almost exclusively throughout the products. Well, that is when they're not trying to use XOR encryption instead. So I reverse engineered it, and I've got a simple C implementation. And this is also used for the authentication of the IDE files, which is a bit of a problem. Obviously, being a 64-bit cipher, it's pretty dated. But really, I discussed it with some colleagues who know cryptography, and opinion is generally that it doesn't look too badly designed. It isn't obviously weak. It hasn't been peer-reviewed, obviously, so who knows. But we think it was probably designed by a real cryptographer. But it's dated and obsolete now, and really shouldn't be used. But it doesn't really matter because Sophos misuse it because it's a symmetric cipher. Sophos quite often use it when they need secrecy, and then they simply just try and hide the key within the product, which is obviously essentially just obfuscation scheme, not encryption scheme. And Sophos pretty much do this everywhere. It's also used for the authentication of these IDE files, because they have to hide the keys within the product itself. You couldn't really consider it an encryption scheme. It's more of an obfuscation scheme. So Sophos repurposed this algorithm to sign the IDE files that users download. They use 32 bits of the 64-bit internal state, and they consider this the signature. It's not a real crypto mode. This doesn't really make any sense, and it's trivial to sign our own updates. And in fact, I've written a tool to do this. However, I shared some of this information with Sophos before today, and they've told me that they kind of conceded that this was a weak point, and they've told me that they're going to fix this. And I'm told that they're already testing a real signature scheme based on SSL, which is good news. But really, because they only use 32 bits for this authentication, you could brute force it even if it wasn't weak. So it's kind of a strange design. So because of this weak authentication scheme based on this 32 bits of pretty much nonsense, it makes transport security essential because you have to download these updates from Sophos to keep your product up to date, obviously. But Sophos are simply not using transport security. They basically distribute these over HTTP using Akamai. And the only authentication is this SPMA signature. So they're really relying on obfuscation to prevent attackers from interfering with the product, and really it's not very good. So yeah, and I'm releasing tools where you can produce your own ID files today. So yeah, Sophos used SPMA to encrypt sensitive product data, but it's a symmetric cipher, so that they're just hiding these keys within the product. However, sometimes they're also using external encryption on top of this to hide the data, but of course this is just trivial nonsense. It's trivial to recover these keys, and using standard reverse engineering techniques, it just doesn't make sense. So yeah, so Sophos used obfuscation where real cryptography could have worked. I mean, of course, signature schemes are well known. There's no reason that they had to invent their own scheme. They've produced this very weak system where there are well-known published information on how to make real good strong schemes using cryptographic primitives already written by real cryptographers. So I've really no idea where they did this. So Sophos don't use a good quality encryption in their products, and the weak encryption they do use is often misused, and effectively turning it into an obfuscation scheme. They do try to augment this weak encryption with trivial XOR ciphers, but obviously this just doesn't work. So Sophos are really relying on obfuscation for security. Cryptography is really outside their realm of expertise, and they're really misusing the primitives that even SPMA, in general, even if it made sense, even though it's an outdated algorithm, they're really misusing it and repurposing it for things that it really wasn't intended or not suitable for. So yeah, I spoke to Sophos about this, and they conceded that the authentication scheme was weak, and they assured me that they're going to migrate, or they're already migrating. I'm not really sure the details, to a real signature scheme. And so yeah, they told me they're already testing it for Mac, I think. And I assume it'll be in the next version, which is good news for Windows. And they also told me that they're going to start phasing out the use of SPMA in their products, which is good news. And yeah, they seem to understand the problem, and they're going to work to improve this. So that's good news. So the next section is on pre-execution analysis, which is another stage that Sophos use when trying to detect malicious code. So Sophos basically have tried to determine file type characteristics, and this is used to decide how to handle the file. They do this in a similar way to libmagic on Unix. It's essentially the same principle. They have a very large collection of these different file types that they handle, and there's lots of esoteric file types that you've probably never heard of. I mean, I certainly haven't. But so it's pretty thorough. So they try to identify container formats and archive files, and they handle these appropriately, which would normally be extracting them or getting out the interesting code. You're only interested in the executable code, obviously, so they try to handle that correctly. For native executables and for dynamic HTML and PDF documents, they have a native x86 emulator embedded in the scanner, and they also have an ECMAScript interpreter, which they use to actually run these files and look at what it does. So they also have support for executable packers, and they try to unpack them transparently before the next stages take over. And of course, they try to extract from archives using this file type system. So Sophos shipped a simple x86 emulator actually inside the scan engine. This is used pre-execution on known executable file types and also on unknown file types. So the unknown file type is called WTF files. And they assume they may be DOS.com files, which, I mean, that kind of makes sense. Well, I mean, I guess it's kind of an outdated concept now, but I mean, it's pretty reasonable. So the emulator executes the code for approximately 500 emulated cycles on a very simplistic machine. It's not a full x86 emulator. It doesn't have x87 support. It doesn't understand CPL. Everything's run as if it was ring 0. There's no permission checks or anything like that. It's very simple. They hook things like memory references, and they try to learn something about it that they use for later analysis. They also provide some very simple DOS and NT stubs. The idea is that they handle certain system calls. It's not a very good representation of x86, but an attacker could obviously detect this very easily, or you can bypass it. You don't really have to bypass it. You can just spin for 500 cycles and Sophos won't do anything. But it's pretty clearly designed for speed rather than accuracy, and I think that's fair enough. Yeah. So many features that I aim are just basically broken and haven't worked. The NT stub is a good example of this, because Sophos really understood how the NT kernel worked. So what happened was when you try to make a system call directly without using the standard API, which you'd normally go through in2E to do this, and Sophos tried to handle that, which is fair enough. But unfortunately, they did it completely incorrectly. They actually hard-coded the system call numbers, and this simply doesn't make sense on Windows because on every release and service pack, these change. So they actually hard-coded the system call numbers from a Windows 2003 SP1 kernel, and these are the only system call numbers that they recognize. So the chance of any code pretty much ever doing this is basically 0, and this code has never worked. So it kind of demonstrates an interesting misunderstanding about how NT works. So there are similar problems throughout it. They have some feature that's intended to catch some strange edge case, and it just doesn't work. Or it works in like some very specific edge case that's not general at all. The intention of the emulator is to record execution characteristics, which is mostly broken because they rely on things like these NT stubs that don't work. And they also improve memory references, and it allows simple decryption loops to run before using the static signatures. However, it's trivial to defeat because a naive adversary can just spin for 500 cycles before unpacking, and then it doesn't do anything. Obviously, they can't run it forever because people wouldn't tolerate that. So it's easy to defeat. So Sophos also ship a number of native unpackers. They actually ship a lot of unpackers, but from an attacker's perspective, the only interesting ones are the native ones. So these are the ones I'm going to cover here. Executable packers are widely used in software distribution. But the problem for antivirus vendors is that it's really a very simple zero-skilled way to transform one executable into an equivalent but different executable, which of course bypasses a blacklisting scheme. So even a moderately skilled attacker would just write an equivalent program. It doesn't make any sense. But you can kind of see that maybe there's an argument that they want to prevent zero-skilled attackers from doing anything. So they build in the support for native unpackers. So many vendors ship these large numbers of unpacker support as a selling point, and Sophos do this as well. And they support a number of pack formats. So these are the native unpackers that I found. Native support for. Most of these are obsolete. There's things like Diet and PK-Lite, which are DOS compressors. LZXer, UPX, from a very early version of UPX from 2001. Petite, which is, as you can see, it's very old. And certain versions of these more modern ones, which is ASPack, FSGMP Compact. With the exception of PE Compact, which I think Sophos licensed from the vendor because it contains some copyright strings, the rest seem to be written by Sophos. But they only support the default options and codecs that the packer supports, and they're not very tolerant of any modification. But it turns out that testing this was really hard because they only support one very specific version, and I had to download dozens of ancient versions from shareware archives to find a working input. So it was hard work to do this. I had to find very specific versions before I could find one that Sophos actually recognized. And some of these are quite rare now because, I mean, obviously nobody saves all DOS unpackers. So yeah, I had to browse through very deep archives in like Simtel, MS-DOS archives and things like this before I could even test them. So based on the amount of trouble I had to go through to get these to work, it took me hours to try and find the correct version to find a supported executable. I don't think there's much a chance that a naive attacker would have much trouble defeating the system. If you just download the latest version, then problem solved. So unfortunately, this is quite a considerable attack surface that they support different codecs and decompression modes, and this is all pretty old and ancient code. These are still shipped, but they're irrelevant and obsolete, and it's pretty much wasted attack surface. I really doubt that this could possibly ever make any difference at all, just because they're so specific, and that no attacker would ever do this because it doesn't make any sense. So Sophos do support a large number of container and archive formats. Things like zip files and tar files and so on. I looked through a lot of the decoders. In fact, there's really hundreds of them, and I couldn't go through them all. But I went through some of the common formats. They do vary in quality. Some just don't make any sense or are completely broken. For example, the ELF decoder, which Sophos tried to use to pull out executable code from ELF files, it specifically calls out Siemens Infineon Tricore executables, which is used in industrial microcontrollers. The test doesn't make any sense because ELF defines hundreds of esoteric architectures for chips that nobody's ever heard of. This one specific case where they handle Tricore. And the only explanation I can find is really that I think that there must have been a customer must have complained that their Tricore executables were having CRC collisions, and I think Sophos must just basically whitelisted the entire architecture. So it's the only explanation I can think of. So one of the major selling points that Sophos put on their website is that they support genes and genotypes. It's undocumented apart from the technobabble that they use in the specifications, which is very sciencey sounding, but it doesn't really explain what they do. However, there is a company that representing them that patented it in the US, so we can see some of their rationale and understand what they were trying to do. So the idea is pretty trivial. A gene is just an arbitrary characteristic that's defined either statically in the core engine that Sophos ship, or in subsequent identity updates. They can define them arbitrarily. And then they create combinations of these characteristics, which they call a genotype, and then they would blacklist it as malicious when they have a certain number of characteristics that match. So yeah, it's so some of these are defined using pre-execution analysis. The emulator will record some, for example, such as things like the read TSC instruction was used. Or, for example, it tried to divide by 0. That would be another characteristic that Sophos record. And then if an executable file has multiple of these different, a blacklist combination of these characteristics, then it's considered malicious. So genes can be characteristics found by emulation or at runtime or statically. For example, things like some of the genes that are quite commonly used are things like embedded URLs found, or an IRC command was found. And these are used quite heavily. I guess because these botnet things use IRCs for communication. So I spoke to a Sophos engineer about this, and he seemed pretty reasonable about it, and he explained that he felt that antivirus still had a place. They read some early drafts of my paper, and they explained that they were going to make some changes based on my criticism. So my paper, I'm going to release my paper later today, so you can read more technical details. This is just intended to be a high-level overview. So they told me that they're going to start phasing out the use of SPMAA, and they're going to start using a real cryptographic scheme for signature, and that they're going to start re-evaluating the BOP system that's commonly used for runtime exploit mitigation. So yeah. So my conclusion about this is that Sophos have demonstrated real naivety in lots of areas key to the efficacy of this product. They misuse crypto quite almost consistently throughout the product, and then they rely on XOR for secrecy. Things like misunderstanding anti-system calls are pretty much unforgivable for an antivirus vendor where this is supposed to be their core focus. And they really fail to comprehend rudimentary exploitation techniques such as Lipsy, which is they themselves claim is a core feature of the product. So I think it's safe to say that Sophos technology at the moment is not really equipped to deliver on the promises that they've made. And so I'm going to be releasing a paper, my paper later today that you can read. And I've also got tools the tools that I've described will also be released, and you can use that to reproduce my results and examine it further if you wish. So yeah, that's the end of my talk. Are there any questions? So the question was, do I feel that other antivirus vendors are in a similar boat? And I really haven't looked, so I don't really feel that I can give an impression of how they look. Just because of the large number of vendors, it's impossible to look at them all thoroughly. So I focus on Sophos for this time. Yep. Sorry, can you repeat that? So the question was about the industry testing sites, the AV comparison, and what should be done about that. So they all pretty much sort of follow the same format at the moment, which is basically they have this collection of malware, and then they just scan it and record who gets the most hits. I don't really think that this makes much sense. It's they treat it entirely as a black box. They don't understand what it's doing or whether it makes sense or not. I mean, it's pretty clear that you can make a shell script that runs MD5 sum and does the same thing, right, and passes this test with flying colors, and clearly that's not a very good security product. So yeah, I don't really know. Comparisons like that don't seem to make much sense. Yeah. I think it's hard to tell basically because the way that they evaluate it is just so simplistic. I think it's hard to measure that, and I think instead of measuring like that, you should be trying to see what kind of attack surface you're exposing in exchange for what kind of benefit. And really, in the case of Sophos, it's really a lot of attack surface, and I think the benefit is really quite minimal, really. Because basically the signature scheme is basically just a big collection of CRC32s, and I'm not really sure that you should be trading huge amounts of attack surface just for this collection of CRC32s. So, any other questions?
Do you have plans for what's your next research project?
I don't know. I guess I'm kind of sick of antivirus at the moment, so probably not more antivirus related stuff. My main work is vulnerability research and discovery, so I guess it'll be back to that. Yes?
So you mentioned the increased attack surface Sophos provides with any antivirus threats. Have you tried targeting the antivirus product itself specifically?
You mean for vulnerabilities?
Yes.
Yeah, in the past, I mean, I've published vulnerabilities in lots of antivirus vendors before. In this particular case, I didn't want to talk about vulnerabilities because then the research is outdated as soon as Sophos fixed them. I really wanted it to be an overview of the design and basically the missing technical specifications for the product. Any other questions?
Do you have reason to think that this is prevalent across other products too? Or do you think this is Sophos especially? Why did you choose Sophos?
So no particular reason for picking Sophos. I mean, I had to start somewhere. I don't really know whether Sophos is kind of representative of the industry or not. I'm not a malware researcher. I'm not particularly interested in malware. I'm a vulnerability researcher, so this is the way that I approached it. So any other questions? Okay. Thanks very much.